before I get started, I want to thank some of our other consultants on this team. So as I said, Christian was the person who led our consultant team with Sound and Vision. We had Mark Wiener from Winning Mark, but we also had some folks who did the polling from FM3, and then Echo Northwest helped a lot, especially with this whole guidebook and kind of going deep into each tool we're about to cover. So we've got four different categories of tools that we're going to talk about, and that's taxes on income, taxes on property, taxes on goods and services, and then fees and charges. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about jargon that I'll be using a little bit while we continue to talk, which is this an adequate source of funding for your revenue problem? That's just meaning how much money is this revenue source anticipated to bring in? So it'll be, this has a lot of money, this is a high, big bang for your buck to implement it. This kind of just covers administrative costs or only covers the services that it's tied to. And then, is it stable? Is this a constant source of revenue over time? Is this dependent on the season? So like when you're talking about something like a lodging tax that has up and down seasons for tourism, maybe it's dependent on that. Is it dependent on market? Is it dependent on citizen behavior? So all of those things can kind of make a revenue source less stable or more stable. Is this something that's versatile? This is also, is it a narrow use or a broad use? Can I apply this to all different things, what have you? And then when we talk about horizontal equity, you'll probably hear me frame it more as there are people who are similarly situated that pay about the same or are treated the same way. And then vertical equity, the two words you'll hear me use a lot in this category are, is this a progressive tax or is it a regressive tax? And for you who are not huge finance or tax people, regressive is typically that it holds your low income folks to a same or higher standard as your higher income folks, and it's not tiered based on income. So that's where you'll see progressive is typically tiered by income. And then we'll talk about different nexuses, whether it has a strong or weak link to what is being paid and what service is being provided on the other side. So just wanted to do that. In the toolkit itself, there are a couple of other measures that they go through on every single tool, but those are the big ones that we'll kind of talk through today. And don't want people to get shocked by some of the jargon as we go through this. So the other thing that we have to cover before we go deep dive into things is, unfortunately, there are preemptions on cities. As a lot of people know, the LOC does not like preemptions, which means the state or federal government telling us things that we cannot do. But in the tax codes, both at the state and federal level, there are things we can't tax. So a couple of those are cigarettes, other tobacco products, and vape products. Same with alcohol, the gross receipts on commercial activity and grocery sales, unless you had one before, I think it was 2019, right, Christian, when the state did their corporate activity tax, and then we are preempted from doing real estate transfer tax. There is one local government who is allowed to do it in the state of Oregon. So those are some of the things that we can't tax. And I say this, the top couple of them, we get state shared revenues as cities from the state, so we can't tax them, but we get a little bit of a portion back. And with other ones, that's not always the case. So we'll start with Oregon's favorite tax, the sales tax, and I'm being incredibly sarcastic when I say sales tax is popular in Oregon. As everyone on this call knows, and anyone watching, Oregon is one of the last two states to not have a sales tax, and that means that it tends to be really unpopular. And we did some polling this time around, and it continues to be unpopular. The one thing that we miss out on a sales tax is, one, it's that third leg of the stool, and it also typically has broad applicability. In most states, it funds things like transit, sometimes education, and other things that don't have a nice tax mechanism with them. The other thing that we'll kind of talk about in the umbrella of sales taxes is things like targeted sales tax. Well, you see this with gas taxes, you see this with lodging taxes, construction excise taxes, etc. So there are some specific targeted tax that we have on the books at the local level and at the state level. Okay, so let's talk about the general sales tax. I think all the things I just said are applicable here, which is we don't have one statewide. There have been a couple of cities who have tried and always failed to pass sales tax. One of the most recent ones was in the city of Ontario, which borders the Idaho border, where Idaho has a 6% sales tax. They tried to go after a much smaller sales tax, and it failed miserably. Like I said earlier, this is one of those taxing mechanisms that can be very broad and flexible with your revenue sources. It can be a significant amount of funds depending on your population or the business activity that's coming into your city. But the other things about sales tax is it can be considered regressive. However, there are lots of people in different states and different localities who have found ways to protect vulnerable community members by having exemptions like no tax on groceries or no tax on medication. So if this is something your city decides to use, you may want to look into some of those exemptions. Now moving into the targeted sales tax, this is usually dependent on your market for that good or service. So it takes in less revenue than your general sales tax. And then, it's not as broad. As I said, we talked about hotel motels. We'll talk about that at in a couple of slides from now. But what we've seen is car rentals, food and beverage. The city of Ashland for a very long time has had a food and beverage tax on the books. A couple of folks have tried to recreate that with less success. So it is a tool. And then same with car rentals. We saw the city of Redmond go after a car rental tax. So this tax, people are still generally not okay with sales taxes, even if they're targeted. Christian, it looks like you want to say something to add here.
Well, yeah, Jenna, I think the discussion that you had about the general sales tax is important, and that has created a political environment where folks are really resistant to sales taxes generally. And once you start narrowing the base of the tax onto small parts of the economy, the revenue that you generate really starts dropping. So, one example of a car rental tax, Multnomah County has a car rental tax, has had it for a number of years. It's a very small piece of the county's overall business taxation because it's just capturing such a small part of the economy. So that's always the challenge with any of these taxes, is that, they are generally a little bit more attractive to voters than general sales taxes because they don't see, maybe they see it targeting out-of-state visitors or something like that, but at the same time they're raising significantly less revenue, and so sometimes what we say is the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
And I would add to that, that's another example, going back to the, how to get to yes. If you have a targeted sales tax, you are targeting a particular sector of the economy that may be motivated to spend money to defeat it. So that's another one where make sure you've got a wide peripheral vision, that your idea isn't picking up significant funded opposition that will probably tank it.
Yeah, it's very important to get industry on your side, especially if you're going after a niche targeted sales tax. Moving on to some of the targeted sales tax that we see kind of pretty regularly, that the state also adopts, cities adopt, and sometimes our county counterparts adopt. We can talk gas taxes or fuel taxes. Right now, 32 cities in Oregon have a local ballot approved gas tax. That is a preemption. It has to be approved by the voters if a city wants to bring it into their revenue stream. The other thing that is unique-ish about this sales tax, there are a couple of taxes that, the state says, if you collect it, we're already collecting it, we'll collect it on your behalf. And so that's the nice thing with the gas tax, is ODOT already collects it for the state, and so there is that mechanism for cities. The big thing about a gas tax, and I think a lot of people know this, I'm not shocking anyone when I say it's expected to decrease a lot over the next decade. Oregon is looking at, there's already a law on the books to moving to EVs by I think 2035. So we're 10 years out from that. We're seeing more efficient cars. We're seeing more electric vehicles already, and it's just not keeping up with the demand because not everyone is driving gas guzzlers anymore. And so cities are already seeing that decline. We'll probably continue to see that decline. It is also some parts of our gas tax revenues play into our state shared revenues on the Highway Trust Fund, and it also is dependent on how much the state wants to give back to local governments to continue to do their operation and maintenance. And so I know one of the things that I'll just flag for folks watching this is that 2025 is one of the years that we're hoping to see another transportation package. And that could play into gas taxes. It could move us to a system of vehicle miles traveled taxes, or it could kind of hold the gas tax still on the books for a while, looking at a way to transition that kind of captures new technologies. And then, like it says on the screen, this is dependent on consumption of fuel. It doesn't keep up with our new technologies. That's something that we need. And then also the revenue mechanism is constrained on what you can use your gas tax revenues for. So that's a big part of this one as well, is that it really can only be used on transportation infrastructure. And that's always the hard thing with transportation funds. So you're not looking, it doesn't help with transit. It really just helps pave your roads and cover potholes. We'll move into the other targeted tax that we have as a sales tax, which is the local lodging tax. There's a map here on the slide that shows kind of the counties in dark blue that have a lodging tax, which is 16 out of 36 counties. And then 106 cities, there are small blue dots. Those are all of the cities. And so almost half of our cities charge a lodging tax. This mechanism is always a hotly debated thing. It is a #1 priority to get more flexibility for LOC this legislative session, but it applies to your hotels, your motels. It can apply to campgrounds and short-term rentals, depending on how your ordinance is structured. The issue with lodging taxes is that in 2003, there was a preemption put on the state books when the state passed their lodging tax that made it so all new and increased taxes after 2003 had to be spent to a 70-30 split. 70% is dedicated to tourism-related facilities that can withstand 10 years of use and abuse. So they have to meet that threshold, and then tourism promotion, marketing for people. And then 30% is discretionary funds for local jurisdictions. What we learned in our polling is that voters tend to be pretty fine with, they have a high tolerance for passing lodging taxes, because I think one of you told me, don't tax me, tax the person behind the tree. And when you have a visitor coming in, that is why people are like, I'd rather tax the person coming into my community. It's not necessarily going to impact me. So that is one of the things that we see. That doesn't get rid of our preemption, even though the voters are fine with passing lodging taxes and think they could be a little bit more flexible. That's something that we have to continue to work with the legislature. And I will say that this one has, to your point earlier, Mark, a huge industry behind it protecting that 70-30 split. So getting anything done will take a lot of energy at the state level and at the local level when we're trying to implement this successfully. And then the next one is the construction excise tax. This one is a little bit more nebulous. It has a lot more parts to it. I know we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and so this is one of those tools that you might look to for that. It's a dedicated funding source for affordable housing and schools. It's based on the cost of your construction permit, so it's kind of taken out of the property tax system, which is nice. But I know in this crisis of development we're having, even though voters think we have a growth management crisis, developers need to kind of be on board when you bring this one on. And there's some caps in place that you have. It's capped at 1% total for cities and counties. So if it's a shared site that's on city and county land, you have to kind of negotiate with them and get them on board. And then you get up to 4% of admin costs. And then there's a formula up on the screen that the rest of it has to go to. When you're doing commercial or industrial builds, you get a little bit more flexibility. It's uncapped for the cost, but again, you have to get business buy-in to pass a construction excise tax. And then 50% of that has to go to developer incentives, and 50% is then unrestricted to what you want to use it for. So an interesting tool for some folks. I think whenever we see a tax structure or a fee structure get pitted against developers, it's always a hard thing to overcome.
I'll just add, Jenna, as the construction excess, this last edition of the construction excess tax, I think this was amended in 2017. It was around the time when the legislature was working through what inclusionary zoning might look like in the Portland metro area. And developing this structure was really collaboration between housing advocates and the construction industry, really trying to address the need for affordable housing funding. So it's just another example of how you can bring industry in early sometimes to try and build a solution around a particular revenue tool that's going to fund some shared values.
Yeah, I think the other thing to also add on this, outside of just like, some of the people coming together to solve a shared problem, I think one of the gives that local governments gave up in this, especially when it's residential and affordable housing, right, is that they're also looking at offering 50% developer incentives there as well, which could be an SDC credit or waiver, which, when we're talking about a funding crisis, I'm not jealous of all of the local leaders who have to make the hard decisions of we really do need housing for our folks, but this also might contribute to our revenue hole, right? And then not necessarily having a voter base that sees that all the time.
It's also one of the challenges of having local taxes established at the legislature.
Absolutely. If they left it to us to do it, I think the world would spin a little bit faster. That's what we've got on sales taxes. If you guys have questions, I'll be monitoring the Q&A panel. Happy to kind of dive into this if anyone has questions. Give it a couple seconds. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. The goal will be throughout this section to do Q&A after each section of taxes or fees so that you guys can engage with it and that we don't get too far along that you don't have, we can't get your questions answered. So with that, we'll move on to income taxes. This will be a very short section, as in there's not a lot going on in the income tax world statewide. I should very much caveat that. So taxing your community members on what they earn. At the onset, it's not very popular amongst local governments. Part of that is because it's hard to administer and to kind of work out. We'll talk about the ones who do have it in a moment. And then it is a high risk, high reward revenue where it brings in significant revenues, but it's a very volatile tax source. So it's not super stable and it's hard to forecast. I have experience having worked for a jurisdiction who has an income tax, and you're always surprised by, oh wow, that forecast was way up than what we thought. Oh, it's way low, and you're not getting a lot of landing room when you're seeing that. And then, yeah, it's just not popular. It tends to be a larger jurisdiction. Mark, it looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, it is. But this is one where you also need to be very sensitive to what's going on in the world. So there was a period, I can't even remember, it was right around 2000. There were terrible budget cuts at the state level, at the local level, education, healthcare, everyone was being really gutted. And against all expectations, this was in Multnomah County, which is its own special place, of course. The voters approved a Multnomah County temporary income tax. And it passed because it was very well designed to say, we're in an emergency, here's what the money is going to go to. It matches exactly to what you're worried about in our community, whether it's schools, healthcare, other essential services, including public safety. And it's not permanent. We need to get through this. Well, it did pass, And then almost immediately, remember how I said, voters always get the last word? Even though the voters had approved it, signatures were gathered to repeal it. And so within, I think it was a year or two after it passed, there was another campaign to repeal it, and it withstood the repeal. So we had to run the campaign to say, don't repeal this, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction. We actually had an ad, I remember. It's like, mad at government, vote them out. But don't take it out on people who have nowhere else to turn, which are, kids and seniors and other people. And at the end of the day, even though it was a cranky electorate, they went, yeah, you're right, shouldn't do that. And so just be aware that income taxes are tough, especially local ones, but it also kind of depends on the environment and the feedback loop and how you're constructing things. That goes with any of these revenue mechanisms, by the way, but this is an anecdote that's specific to a local income tax.
Yeah, that's right. And so we'll dive deeper into the business versus the personal income tax, which, we've already said, and we don't need to go further on this point, that they're administratively and can be politically challenging depending on what the climate is happening. On the business side, it could cause business migration, especially if you're in a space where if you move to the next city over and relocate your business, there is no business income tax. So we'll talk about the ones that have income taxes in this state, which is the city of Portland, Multnomah County, and Metro as a regional government entity that does most of the Tri-County area in the Portland region. And so there, it could benefit a business not moving from Portland to somewhere else in Multnomah County, but maybe going a little bit further out where they only have the Metro tax that's impacting them. And then one of the things with income taxes as well is this is something that the federal government does, this is something that the state does, and people really like to see parity across all of those entities, which can make there be, one, some conflict. You really want to have a good tax lawyer on hand to help craft it, so you're not double taxing anyone and how you're doing certain entities. But the other part of it is, how are you carefully curating local decisions when it comes to when you're disconnecting from state and federal tax code? Because that comes up, and I see it politically at the legislature, where people come back and they're like, I'm upset that the voters passed this thing that is different than the state or different than the feds. And so for us, we're like, the state can disconnect from the federal government, and so can local governments from the state and the feds. So protecting that authority is something we're constantly doing. And then, as I said, collection can be burdensome. On the business side of this, businesses usually have someone who takes care of their taxes for them. Shifting to the personal side, you really need to be good customer service folks when it comes to charging a personal income tax, because that's usually you're dealing with everyday people. I've heard most of the local income taxes, personal income taxes, are now going to be on TurboTax, which makes some folks, like your tax preparers, excited. And on that, staying on personal income tax, this can be really dependent on your population size again, on what type of income earners are within your population. It's typically a more progressive tax structure, kind of following what the state and feds do, where you're establishing a floor and going up from there, and it being an incremental tax. And then, but at the same time, if I'm a person, it's less glaring on the personal income tax and the business income tax. You could migrate to a nearby city.
Yeah, I'll just add, Jenna, the migration effect that we see in the tax literature, it's been most recorded on property taxes. And so you'll see inside of a single housing market, essentially, cities with significantly higher property taxes than other cities, they'll see a migration effect. We haven't seen a lot of income tax data around migration, just because moving state to state is a very different thing. We all know here in Oregon about the difference between Idaho and Washington and some of our border cities, but outside of those kind of narrow border situations, we just don't have the same kind of data. But we'll learn more with some of these local income taxes, just how that works. I will say on the business side, I think what's really important for for city tax administrators to think about with a business tax is to, one, work with your business community early to figure out where kind of like the hard points and the opposition is going to come from. A lot of times you'll see more openness to a business tax if it is dedicated to a certain purpose, or if it has an exclusion for small businesses. I think a lot of businesses, if you're a larger employer, you have more skin in the game with the city and want to see the city move forward on certain projects. You might have some shared priorities. For those small businesses, you're a hairdresser or something, and you've got gross receipts below a certain level. Surprise, you owe a business tax at the end of the year can be a real burden for them. And so that's what you see typically with these local business taxes as a carve out for lower gross receipts businesses.
Yeah, and I think also on that point, cities usually also have license fees that are much, much lower than what you're taxing from a business income tax. So that kind of may collect some of the small business folks, not in their gross receipts, but down at the license level. One of the things I was also thinking about that's important to note for this, but for every revenue mechanism, is the balance of the nexus of what it's paying for, right? Like when we look at the business income tax in the Portland metro region, you've got the Portland business tax that is more general fund based, same with the Multnomah County one, and then the metro one is solving a particular thing, which is solving for homelessness and homelessness services, and where businesses may want to come in and agree because they see a need across the region or across your city. Hey, we would really like you to provide more homelessness services. That sounds like it'll benefit me as a business owner and not some of the other things. And then on the personal income tax side, we see that as well. Metros is the same, goes to the same purpose. And then with Multnomah County and the cities of Portland is a little bit different, and it's a flat fee, which you don't usually see in personal income taxes, which pays for their art tax. And then for Multnomah County, it's preschool for all. So they also found a need that they were trying to solve for. And Mark, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, just as a general rule, though, this brings up a phrase that Christian used before, but I want to repeat: is the juice worth the squeeze? That's some of these things are very complicated, and you have to negotiate or navigate a lot of political or interest-based currents. But it's worth it. The revenue you're getting, it makes it worth the effort. But that's always a measurement that you should be taking on this or any other mechanism. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
And sometimes it might start that way, and then you might get midway through and say, there's too many carve-outs, we're not actually getting enough revenue to take this to the ballot or continue to fund an effort like this. We'll go to the last income tax that you see in local jurisdictions. You also see it at the state level. They passed this with the last transportation package in House Bill 2017, which is a payroll tax, and it can generate some decent-sized revenues with a lower rate than what you see typically on other income taxes. It will be dependent on how many businesses and employees you have in your jurisdiction. And then, so if you're a bedroom community, this might not be the tax mechanism for you. The other thing is that for collection, it's typically done by the employer who takes it out of their payroll and then remits it to the government. So that can be nice, where you don't have to set up your own system to do it. It's typically a flat rate, so it can be a little bit regressive. And what we've typically seen it used for is things like transportation, but I know the city of Eugene also has one that's more public safety focused, so it can be used for other things. But right now, mostly a transportation mechanism and not widely used by cities, used quite a bit by transit districts and a few other special districts.
Yeah, I would say the payroll tax is really like one of the bedrock taxes in the United States. Folks probably know that it's used to fund both the unemployment insurance program, which is a federal program that the states operate, as well as Social Security. And as Jenna mentioned, there are a number of payroll taxes that the state collects, including for paid sick leave and the family leave program. I will caution folks that These taxes tend to be very susceptible to negative messaging because voters see them as a tax on their wages, much more so than an income tax, especially a progressive income tax that a voter might imagine they're less likely to pay. So what we've seen in some of these campaigns where maybe initial polling looks kind of promising, but then the process to bring it to the ballot doesn't remove the paid opposition, the opposition's messages that are very effective in eroding voter support, and the payroll tax doesn't succeed at the ballot.
Yeah. So that rounds us out on payroll taxes or income taxes generally. So if anyone has questions, I'll invite you to put them in the Q&A tab on the Zoom, and I'll give it a couple of seconds. Okay, we'll move on. We'll talk everyone's favorite tax, which is property taxes. So we're going to kind of do a little bit of a background to some of the slides I had earlier, but we'll really kind of dive into Measure 5, Measure 50 limitations. On the top, we'll talk about what compression is. That becomes a political thing when we're talking about any type of property tax revenue. And then most of these require voters' approval and voter support. There's a couple that we'll get to that can be done administratively, but most of the time this is a voter call, and you really need to get support and have a good strategy to getting to the ballot, putting it on that, and keeping in mind sharing with your voters what they're voting for. So remember Measure 5 and 50, we talked about this. This is a repeat slide. So Measure 5 establishes those limits, and Measure 50 created a permanent rate and assessed value, and it only grows 3%. So those are kind of the things that you need to be aware of. But the big thing that we didn't talk about at the beginning is what happens when you hit that Measure 5 limit. So compression happens. That's the answer. What is compression? So essentially, when you hit a Measure 5 limit, you're compressed proportionally, and your levy rates will go first, and same will your special districts. So once that gets reduced to 0, then compression starts eating into a permanent rate. And so it goes across all of the taxing districts in that area when you hit a Measure 5 limit. And then to reiterate, general obligation bonds are not subject to compression. On the screen, you'll see kind of a table of some of our more recent data on the impacts of compression to local governments. So at large, it's $155 million loss to all taxing districts, with schools being the top losers in compression, followed by cities. And so cities lose almost $50 million right now a year to compression. And we have 182 cities that are in compression right now. So that comes into play because if you're already in compression, some of these tax mechanisms and revenue solutions are not going to actually help you. And so wanting to keep compression in mind, compression is also a very political conversation with your other taxing districts. When we're talking about stakeholders, if this is something that's going to cause compression, you're really going to want to talk to your other taxing districts around you. So we'll talk about the most popular local property tax measures that we see on the ballot every year and kind of compare them. That's local option levies and general obligation bonds. Of course, they require voter approval. The levies are subject to compression and are one of those moments when you need to be careful of overlapping taxing districts, because it might not affect every property in your city's boundary, but it could do a couple, especially if you are a city in a bi-county area where you have 2 counties, or a tri-county area. You could have a segment of your folks who end up being compressed, and that will eat into the revenues you're looking for. Typically, these are where ballot language comes into play with clear nexus of what you're doing and how much you're going to spend. And then another important note with local option levies is at this moment, they're time limited. They are subject to a 5-year limit if they're operating levies. So you see this for parks, you see this for libraries, police, EMS, things like that. And then 10-year if they're capital levies. On the other side, general obligation bonds continue to be a good tool for folks because they're not subject to compression. They can bring in significant revenues, but they are capped at 3% of the total real market value of all taxable properties within the taxing district. So it's not something that's on assessed value, so it kind of shows real world examples. The big thing here is it's one time and it's capital investments. So you need a new firehouse, you need a new police station, you need a new city hall. That's typically where you're seeing these funds be spent.
A couple of notes on these, though. On local option levies, 5 years, serial levy, also known as serial levies. For some jurisdictions, for some cities, some counties, they are sort of a way of life. For many years in Multnomah County, the libraries were funded on serial levies until they created their own taxing district. In Clackamas County, I'm sorry, these are county examples, but they're applicable to cities. They have a public safety levy that has been easier to pass in every successive 5-year set. The city of Portland has a levy for the Portland Children's Levy. It gives you a couple of things. First of all, as Jenna said, there's a nexus, hopefully, between what you're paying for and what you get, and people get that. And if you're doing a good job of delivering that service, people say, okay, well, that's the way I pay for my libraries or my public safety. The other thing they enable you to do is when you renew them, you get to utter a magic phrase. I believe it to be a magic phrase. This measure will not increase the tax rate you are paying today. It turns out that voters' ears perk right up when you say that. And you have to be careful. You can't say, or you shouldn't, some people say this, they really shouldn't, said, will not increase the taxes you're paying today? Well, it may, depending on your property value of that. But you can always say, if you're constructing it correctly, will not increase the tax rate you're paying today. So that's one, local option levies for a particular purpose. That's not, the platonic ideal of how you gather revenue to put in a general fund to be able to make decisions across a broad range of services. But they can be politically viable when other things aren't. The other thing on the general obligation bond side, voters tend to like GO bonds more than local option levies. One reason, I see exactly what I'm paying for. This is closest to my walking into an auto dealership example. You are paying for a thing. People can go look at it, touch it, feel it, look at the sketches. People like that because it's not going into some big, slush fund of government, if people think. And the other thing about a general obligation bond strategy, if you take a big capital need that you need, this is true often with school districts who have aging buildings. Your one bond isn't going to do it. But if you construct it correctly, as one bond is coming off, another bond can come on, enabling you to utter the magic phrase, will not increase the tax rate you're paying today. And it becomes sort of an essential long-term strategy for the physical investments you need to make in your community. So these are two fairly flexible mechanisms that have political advantages.
A couple cautions I would offer as well. Planning for a local option levy can be challenging for a small jurisdiction because compression can make the calculation of what the rate might raise difficult to ascertain. General obligation bond, because not subject to compression, you look at the overall value in your taxing jurisdiction, you apply the rate, that's your GO bond rate, that's what your GO bond that's how much GO bond you could buy. Local option levy is different because all of those compression effects are property by property. So it's really helpful to work with a consultant, or if you can get help from your county assessor to better understand, if my rate was this, how much money would I actually raise? I bring that up because, as Mark's mentioned, oftentimes the success of a local option levy is telling voters exactly what you're going to pay for and then delivering on it. And so if your numbers aren't accurate at the front end as you're building the plan for the local option levy. Then on the back end, when you go to renew it, people are going to say, hey, you told me you're going to do a lot of things that you didn't do. And they're not going to take, well, our math was wrong as the answer. The other thing that I would say is that there are examples all across Oregon where our local option levies have become ongoing affairs, and over time, voter support for those levies has increased. We've also seen really difficult situations where voters have said no to a local option levy that's been in place. That's a really big blow because these are often paying for operating costs, which means employees providing direct service to residents. So just like we were talking about in the Getting to Yes section, don't take anything for granted when you're working with your voters. Make sure you're building that community support.
Yeah, Christian, to that point about long-standing levies being on the books and then not, I think what I experienced in kind of the last couple of years is with really high inflation and people trying to figure out how they can afford today's costs, that this has become a bigger conversation piece, which is, can I support this thing that I've continued to support and maybe I haven't seen the services that I thought I was paying for, or it kind of feels like the locality just wants more of my money, right? And so I think that's one of the things I've been seeing just watching election results. The other thing I kind of want to caution too is when Mark says there's a magic word about renewal or re-upping something that only applies to local option levies. It doesn't apply to bonds. That's a brand new set of taxes. You pay down your bonds, so be careful and work with your communication consultants when you do that.
Well, not just your communication consultants, but also your finance people, because if you have a bond expiring at the same time, and you're timing it right, there have definitely been some bonds we've worked on recently where we have been able to say that. The zoo bond is in the Portland metro area is another one. When but the devil really is, as Jenna is saying, in the details. Don't just assume you can say it. Once again, measure twice and cut once, because you don't want to say oops. That is the opposite of magic words.
Absolutely. So definitely work with your county assessors when it comes to anything property taxes. They're the ones who kind of do all your assessed values, make sure that they're sending appraisers out. And one thing I want to mention before we move on from these two things is on the local option levies, that was actually part of the revenue reform polling. And, we saw some decent compelling evidence that we should look deeper into local option levies. And as we've talked about here, some levies have been on the books they've passed and they've passed and they've passed. Is there a threshold maybe that says if it's passed 5 times in the last 25 years, can it just become permanent? Because for every size jurisdiction, kind of having to re-go out for the same levy that's critical to keeping parks people employed, keeping police officers and firefighters on the streets, that is a thing they have to budget for and campaign for. And if it seems like the voters are fine with it, is there a mechanism there? Is there a way to make them permanent in another avenue? Things like that, that I think we'll continue to study in the next side of this revenue reform project, because it was an interesting result that we got on the poll. It was one question, so it didn't tell us a lot, but it told us that we could look into it more. And I think that is something we want to advocate for, because we know it will help just cities continue to operate. And at the end of the day, voters, I don't think will get rid of the ability for them to take it off the tax roll. It just won't be at a 5-year check-in. So the voters will still maintain some control. The next thing to talk about, this is also something that, when Mark and Christian are saying, talk to your county assessors if this is the right option for you. You could have a property in compression. You could have, not the services you're paying for come up. Special districts we're seeing as a tool for folks to continue to pair together with other taxing jurisdictions, maybe it's your county or other area cities, to provide a similar service. So you make a district boundary, and now it no longer has to be paid from the city's only property taxes. One thing here is you also get to establish a new permanent rate, which you can't change right now as a city by yourself. But it can raise concerns about compression. If you are bringing a new special district that doesn't have broad applicability to your neighboring areas and trying to implement it, there's likely going to be a place where the other taxing districts have concerns because they know it might trigger compression. And like local option levies, special districts are also hit first. So don't implement a special district or try to create one if it's not actually going to bring in any revenue. And then implementation can be a little arduous. You have to, basically start a whole new local government to oversee the special district. But what we see across the state that people are kind of making special districts for is water systems, for parks, for fire protection, and for library services. I will underscore library services a lot. We're seeing that one kind of creep up a lot more. Fire protection has always been kind of the bread and butter of special districts, particularly in our more rural areas where there's not a huge population to serve in one jurisdiction, but maybe across a county or a couple of counties, there's enough for folks to do it there.
Yeah, I would say where we've seen these be particularly effective is in places where you have lots of smaller cities with different permanent rates across a sort of contiguous region. So think about Washington County, which has a lot of small cities, but has a few parks districts and a few fire districts because they're all kind of at a similar level of urban development, need a certain similar level of service, but it helps even out the cost of that across a broader tax base.
Yeah. So moving on, local improvement districts. This is a good way to fund a specific need for infrastructure within a UGB. And I say this right now because there's actually a bill up this session that is looking to allow the local improvement district tool to be applied to unincorporated areas like within a city's boundary, but not in their UGB. So it could be a place where the city and the county could use this tool that wasn't thought of when it first came to be. But how local improvement districts work is it's a one-time funding that's usually paid back as a lump sum payment or with the option of being 10-year payments on a property tax bill. It requires property tax or buy-in from property owners because they are the ones who are going to feel it. It also really targets an area for development. So this is approaching urban renewal, but we have some other tools in this toolkit that we'll get to in a little bit that are actually urban renewal focused. And then for a local improvement district, there are some cities that allow and state law allows for local improvement districts to be brought by the city or by their property owners. So the property owners could say, hey, 80% of us agree that we need this improvement district and we're willing to pay in, so let's do it. And that's how it comes up to a city.
And I'll say this is a really great tool to explore with your Main Street advocates. We've seen local improvement districts be very successful at improving trash collection, improving graffiti cleanup, providing sense of security in dense areas. But I think we haven't seen it as commonly in smaller cities. But I do think it's a good finance tool that the state has on the books for cities.
It's also something that can be honestly portrayed as an economic development tool. Because when you're, looking at a local improvement district and say, we could really increase foot traffic, or we could make this more attractive for, either customers or even residents, although it's less used in a residential setting. So this is one where you can have what I like to call unusual suspects or strange bedfellows. This is something where people might say, no. Remember when I say tax that guy behind the tree? No, actually, for this one, you can tax me. So it's a very specific tool, but it can bring some interesting support.
Yeah, and on the economic development tool side of things, it's interesting because this has typically been a business tool. And I think with this change that we're kind of seeing in legislation this year, it's actually targeted more to housing, because that's where you're going to see like greenfield development or UGB expansions is typically for housing. But we know infrastructure is important both for our employment lands and our businesses, but also for people who are in our housing. People like toilets that flush, water that is clean to drink, all of those things, roads that they can get places to. And so I think it'll be interesting to watch this kind of local, like, economic development tool kind of be repurposed and it maybe become a more flexible option. So really sticking in that economic development tool when we're talking what cities can do, we've got a couple of different things. They're kind of similar, kind of different: economic improvement districts, enhanced service districts, business improvement districts. What this is trying to do at a broad level is boost investments in services or boost property values and economic activity. So a little bit like a local improvement district, bringing people, like trying to increase people coming downtown to your main streets, things like that. It's also paid by the property owners and businesses in a designated district. And it can be added to the property tax bill, or some cities do it on their business license fee. So we'll kind of go through the broad differences of some of these things. It's one of those things that you see it, I think, in medium-sized cities and up is usually where I've seen the tool. And so when we're talking about an economic improvement district, this is for capital improvements, infrastructure, beautification, maybe a little bit of marketing. It's typically done as special assessments on property owners in that commercial zone. And it really is targeted at that property owner as the base. And then this, though, requires 33% approval from property owners for it to be viable, and it's time limited. So it's one of those things that is not going to be constant forever. You're not like, it might spark growth in your main street, but it's not going to be that tool that you can constantly rely on, and it's got defined projects and defined goals. Enhanced service districts, this is things like, hey, we need more security at this place. We want people to feel safe. It's beautification, it's street cleaning that you need to come. So services that are going to make your business district look better. It's typically fee-based on your property owners and your business owners, even sometimes your nonprofits. And it's everyone in that district contributes to this. And residential properties, if you're in a mixed zone where you've got commercial and residential, those folks will also likely pay into it as well. And this is a little bit more administratively flexible, where it can be created through city council and through a local ordinance. So and then it's also ongoing as long as the city kind of reviews it and continues to keep it implemented. So a little bit different, where it's not big one-time funds, but can kind of spark growth and continue to grow with the district it's serving. And then on the other side, business improvement districts are similar to our enhanced service districts. They can be services, they can be business, they can also do services. And they're typically linked to the revenue of the business or the property value. And it's taxed just on business owners within the district. And most of the time it's a business. This is Mark saying, tax me, I'm okay with it. We see the benefit, we're coming to the city, we're ready to partner. Can you approve this tax on us? And as long as those businesses still continue to be bought in, it can go on for quite a while.
I think these are really helpful tools that cities should spend some time on, especially if you're working with your local business community around how to address your services gap. Whether it's on the capital side with the previous tool or any of these, you'll see there's a lot of overlap with all of these. I've seen all of these tools, including the last one, used for a lot of things that kind of feel similar, but they're just that sort of bedrock municipal improvement service that really, I know all of our city leaders are really struggling to pay for now after this last bit of inflation.
Yeah. One thing I think I'll add as a cautionary tale here, though, is like there are a lot of, property tax exemptions and stuff that spark economic development. Businesses tend to be kind of also the revenue generators for communities. So I think there's a delicate balance. And I think for something like a business improvement district where it comes from the business, that's really helpful. But really wanting to underscore doing the work with, all of those businesses and making sure that they're bought in on it so it can maintain as a good tool. It's one of those things, you need them as part of your tax base because you can't make it up on the residential side to continue operating. So it's one of those things to consider from a city standpoint.
Yeah, this is very different than sort of a campaign that you would see where you're just talking with the general public. This is really something that has to be driven from the community up.
Yeah. The last one that we're going to talk about is urban, usually referred to as urban renewal, tax increment financing. It's a little spicy, I guess, is how you could refer to it. So urban renewal has kind of had a good and bad history that I think everyone just needs to be aware of, that it has kind of contributed to displacement for vulnerable populations and some gentrification. So keep that in your mind. People do typically have a big reaction when you bring up anything related to urban renewal. But it has some benefits to the cities and how it's marketed. So we'll go over the good first and then kind of the bad. Tax increment financing is based on your assessed value, so it's allowed to grow with the district and with what you're taxing. It's one of those things that you can say you're not increasing or adding any new taxes because it's based on that gross of assessed value. We're starting to see it pop up in the legislature on things as well as a tool that the state wants to utilize. And then it pays for, certain projects that are developed in an urban renewal plan that is adopted by the city council. And those projects have to be benefiting the geography of the boundary in the plan area. So there are a lot of layers on it that can help people see the need for it. We know exactly where you're developing, we know what projects you're having ahead of time, we can continue to do this. On the bad side of it is this is a place where you have to get your other taxing districts on board, because what's funneling these revenues and why you can say that it's not raising anything or adding new taxes is because overlapping tax districts are foregoing their revenues to fund this within the urban renewal area. So they're saying, we also see the need that you're coming with us cities, and we want to be a part of that financing structure. But this one is where everyone screams compression, you're in my territory, I don't see the benefit. And so this is a way that you need to get as much buy-in as possible. And then for this, because you're tying it to assessed value and that's how you're growing this tax base, for some places, it could take a while for it to grow based on how big your tax base is and to get enough money to go into significant projects. So it's a tool. People use it successfully across the state, but you have to be careful about how you use it, and it's very controversial.
Yeah, I would say to put a finer point on the multi-jurisdictional thing, this is often an example of robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's great if you're Paul, but you might want to check on the neighborhood Peters. And the other thing is, I want to emphasize the long-term impact on this, and it's in the category of sometimes be careful what you wish for. It can work just the way you expected it to work, and then you get to the end of it and you go, oh, yeah, but that happened. So gentrification and our affordable housing. You look at the 2040 plan in Metro, for example. There was a lot of vision about how you can stimulate this kind of growth and raise property values and you know, make these neighborhoods that are struggling fantastic and very desirable. And in a lot of cases, it worked like gangbusters. People didn't really think about, okay, so where do those folks go? And what happens to those communities? Doesn't mean this is a bad idea, but this is a tool, because it goes on a longer term basis and it takes a while to develop. You really want to think about all the elements of what can happen, because the law of unintended consequences can kick in, and once they kicked in, it's really hard to undo. So doesn't mean don't consider it. It's a great, successful strategy, but it has a lot of elements to it, and you really want to think through all of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue. I think that's for almost everything property tax related, and I think that's another thing we didn't delve too much into, but is one of the impacts, particularly with Measure 50, is, you know, the valuation of homes in different places being tied to the 90s means that gentrification nowadays, you see people moving to places that have lower taxes that could have been a place that, you know, has historically had different marginalized communities, that it's just now it's an easy win for business or for homeowners to kind of cut down their tax bill, and it's kind of shifted what those places feel like. And that's a big conversation when we talk about the property tax system, is its inequities, how it's been disproportionately impacting different groups of people. And so thinking about that, it is an impact, and it can be magnified by some of these property tax revenue, additional property tax revenue streams. And so I think that's also one of the reasons why we see that. And it's something to be careful of. You can have businesses paying different property tax rates across the street from each other. You can have neighbors paying different property taxes. And that is that's hard. And that's one of the reasons why the property tax system needs to be fixed.
And frankly, that's one of the reasons LOC launched this larger reform. We're not getting into a lot of the other things that we've looked at and that we're probably going to continue to work on. But one of the examples that, you go to focus groups and you explain to them, now you have somebody who moved from a struggling neighborhood and they moved somewhere else. Other people move into the struggling neighborhood when it becomes gentrified. So you have cases of people who are doing really well. They're high-income people. They've fixed up their house, and they are effectively paying less in property taxes than somebody who is maybe struggling some. And that's an artifact of, sort of our crazy Rube Goldberg property tax system, which needs reform and needs fixing. It's not easy, but it needs it. But that's another one of these unintended consequences that you just want to be aware of.
Yeah, and so that's us wrapping kind of the property tax system. So you don't have to hear us say your favorite things, Measure 5 and 50 anymore. But as Mark pointed out, there are things that we will continue to be studying as the League of Oregon Cities, and it continues to be one of our long-standing priorities, is reforming the property tax system to become more equitable, more adequate for cities, and to really embolden local choice a little bit more than it does. So with that, I'll take some questions. I see one in the Q&A section. Other folks should definitely join in. And I think this question popped up when we were talking about, economic improvement districts, enhanced service districts, business improvement districts. And it's, does this apply to properties that are off the tax roll? And typically not. If they choose to put it through the tax roll and add it as a property tax payment, but if a city decides to do it through a business license tax, depending on what that entity is, and if they pay a business license tax, they could get captured there. So any other questions related to Measure 5, Measure 50, property taxes, all the things? Okay, we'll move on to the last little section here, which is fees and charges. So when we're just summarizing fees and charges, this is typically where you see more constraints on how much revenue you can bring in. Taxes typically bring in a lot more money, even if they're targeted at something, than your fees. The good thing about fees and charges is that they usually only require a vote of your elected officials and your council, not a vote of the people. So they can be administratively easier. They're typically reviewed annually by most cities. But one caveat I want to put at this part of the presentation is we have seen more and more fee increases doing two things in cities, leading to the recall of local officials and also charter amendments. So we've seen at least 6 cities recently have charter amendments where now any revenue raising tool, fee, tax has to go to the voters. It cannot just be done at the elected level. So when Mark says we have to have a really good balance and relationship with our voters, they have power and they will flex it if they feel like the fees are getting out of control. I think one of the other things that I'll say on the fee picture is no one really ever likes a fee increase, right? No one wants to see their water bill go up. No one wants to see their trash bill go up, all of those things. But there have been times when cities stop raising their fees, and then it's harder to make that up because they go from a couple dollar, maybe I'll do it in percentages, and a 5 to 10% increase to a 50% increase, and those can be harder to pass. But sometimes there's a global pandemic and you're freezing fees because people are very concerned about the amount of money they have, and sometimes you freeze fees because you can't get the votes on council. But that's one of those things that I just put out there that cities should consider is if things don't increase with the cost of service and you get really behind, a really large increase can be a really tough pill to swallow when the voters and community members hear about it.
I mean, this is something typically businesses do all the time, but it's around their pricing. And it just takes a lot of real-time management and understanding of what the market will bear. Some people like to use the, boiling a frog thing. If you raise the temperature gradually, nobody notices. There's no science to it. It really takes real-time understanding what the tolerances are. And the other thing about fees is, and there's also no hard and fast on this, you can think of them as barnacles on the hull of a boat. At a certain point, there are too many barnacles on the hull, and it's really degrading the seaworthiness or the performance of the boat. There's no hard and fast rule about when you're just seen as nickel and diming in every single way that really causes some revolt. But once again, that's something that think like a business has to do when they are putting on surcharges or they're making prices. You just have to keep really in touch with what the data says and what the research tells you, is short of fomenting a revolution.
And I would add to Jenna's point, especially in your business-like activities, letting your water fees or your sewer fees fall away from the actual cost of maintaining your facilities can lead to really challenging things in the long run for a city, and can also put political pressure into looking for general fund or other revenues to backfill those costs when they should be paying for themselves as the business side of the city's operation. So I think it's really important to do the hard work, as Jenna was asking. Should you be doing all of these sort of community engagement efforts around things that your council can just vote on administratively? Absolutely. And I think if you have good community engagement around your sewer rates and around your water rates and your wastewater long-term capital planning, you'll have an easier time having a conversation with your council about the need to raise those rates, because they'll have advocates in the community who say, no, it's really true. We need to keep those toilets flushing and make sure that our water system is working.
And think as far in advance as you can, because there are some water systems where 20 years from now we're going to have to build an entire new water filtration plant. In part, I know the city of Portland had to do this subject to federal rules. If you know that whatever not a cliff, that mountain is coming, you may need to start preparing yourself in how you deal with your fees and charges, both from a communications perspective, but also knowing that if you wait too long, that spike, which Jenna is talking about, will be too much for people to bear, but you still can't avoid the expenditure, and that puts you in a real bind.
Yeah, I'll before we move off this topic, I'll also say that really small cities in some ways will never be able to pass a fee to get out of this. Their customer base, the price of infrastructure is so incredibly high that you could keep up with your 5 to 10% increase, things like that, and you still may need a federal grant, a state grant that are out there. So I think just to underscore, we also understand that there are some communities where this will not work because fees are based on the population paying into them, and I don't think every person has $1,000 to put on their water bill every month. I definitely don't have that, and so also population size really pays into being able to maintain. So just that caveat when we're talking about, do you continue to do annual raises? Do you let it sit and then do a really big increase? What are the political ramifications? In some ways, there is also just no financial reality where a city could afford to climb that mountain alone. And that is why we really depend on our state and federal partners when it comes to funding. So we'll dive in. This is franchise fees and utility license fees are something that I used to work on quite a bit at the League of Oregon Cities. So one thing to note is that franchise fees typically are the second or third largest revenue source for cities outside of property taxes. So they can bring in quite a bit of money. What these are is typically a fee for the right or the privilege to use the sidewalks and the streets to put your poles in, to lay your fiber, your water systems, things like that. So it typically is on your utility members. This can be done a couple of ways. Some people have right-of-way ordinances in place that list the fees, and then others have a just typical franchise, which would be individual companies and the city held to this franchise. You typically pay it off of your gross revenues, a percentage of your gross revenues. I will say the typical franchise fees that are more expensive are your telecommunications ones and your cable ones and broadband. I will also caveat that technology is continuing to change. We no longer have, a lot of copper line telephones that makes a telecommunication company different than your cable company that is now projecting your news, that is giving you your internet. A lot of these are now commingling different services. So that's one of the reasons we kind of see more of a right-of-way license or a right-of-way ordinance going into place on these. I will also say that one of the big issues with the more technology-based franchise fees is that there are preemptions both in state and federal law that you have to be watching. Some of these are mostly mandated by the FCC, and their definitions are always changing. So this is something that can be hard for cities to keep up with. And then usually a franchise lasts most of the time 5 to 10 years. So you also have to renegotiate some of these things that are more inclusive than just the fee that the utility is giving you. Sometimes it's also customer service standards and things like that. So they can take a lot of city staff time. There are some tools and guidebooks listed in the broader municipal toolkit that will take you to some models that LOC has produced on the different franchises and utility license fees. And also this is one of those areas that's always changing, and we urge you to use your legal experts to keep your own in the right direction. This next one that I decided to move up and out of order than what we end the municipal toolkit on this, but system development charges are something that cities deal with quite a bit when we're talking about development. It's a pretty bread and butter tool when we're talking about transportation SDCs, water, wastewater SDCs, and the most politically charged and scrutinized SDC is parks SDCs. So system development charges are really meant to help cities gauge their growth and pay for that growth. But there are a couple of things that, we have to talk about when we talk about SDCs. They have strict methodology that has to be followed, and you have to come up with a reasonable way of estimating your current and then projected growth and the capacity in infrastructure systems. So your water system, how much is that actually going to grow? How much more usage is going to be on your streets? What is the goal for cities? How many parks do you need to serve kind of your broader residents? And it's done on a system-wide level. It's not done on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, so it can be hard to explain to people what is really going on and what they're paying for, especially when it comes to the development community. This is something we have come up a lot in the conversation around affordable housing as cities. It's something that the legislature has really tried to delve into. And I think there are two things going on here. One, cities don't have a lot of flexible alternatives for infrastructure funding, and infrastructure is really expensive. The other part of that is that how we charge commercial versus residential SDCs are usually pretty similar, and that also makes new and unique ways of building harder to kind of fit into a box. So one thing we've seen legislatively is that the legislature wants us to build up and in, so do more infill and less building out in new land that's brought into a UGB or into a city. It's easier to kind of estimate your growing need for brand new land that needs infrastructure right now than land that has infrastructure in it right now, but we know there's going to be more use on that system. So it can be one of those tools that not everyone understands, not everyone utilizes, and cities, particularly in the affordable housing realm, get a lot of pressure or grapple with balancing, do I give an SDC waiver? Because I really want to spur development right now, but if I give an SDC waiver, the city is backfilling that money, and where is that money coming from? So it continues to be a cycle where infrastructure is important. Infrastructure is also very expensive. So this is one of those tools that you have to get your developers on board. I would even say, let your broader community know about it. Let your legislators know how you're utilizing the tool, because it does come under scrutiny quite a bit. Anyone want to add anything to this spicy topic before we move on?
This one's particularly spicy.
Yeah.
I think the thing to think about with STCs when you're Jenna, you sort of mentioned this with, you look at other cities in other states where they have a three-legged stool, where they've got a local option sales tax or something that's providing that undergirding support for infrastructure. We just don't have that here. And so every city is working around the edges to try and figure out how to pull together a budget that can actually deliver the services. That's why we see the proliferation of special districts to share costs. That's why we see proliferation of creative political campaigns to raise serial levy resources, and frankly, it's also why the impact of growth is something that we really have to account for in Oregon as cities. And so I think sometimes people struggle when they're trying to make a apples to oranges comparison between the cities here and maybe in other states. And you always have to think through, it's like the tax system's different in other states, and sometimes, you can see that.
We could do an entire webinar, and maybe someday we will, on the impact of growth and how people relate to it. It's really a fundamental driver of a lot of the things we've talked about today. And that, how shall I put it? Oregonians have a lot of feelings about that. With respect to SDCs, there's also a couple of ways of looking at it, and you probably want to think about it. It can be something that is solving an existing problem that people agree that we need to do something about it. It's also something that could be funding an opportunity that people want to see. And so understanding what your SDC is going to go for and how that would connect with a value or an ambition, that is sort of a fundamental way of how to talk about it. But as both Jenna and Christian have said, spicy topic.
Yes, and we mentioned this in the Measure 50 kind of box. Cities' property taxes only grow at 3%. They don't grow with inflation. They don't grow with the market. They don't grow with increased population. So, if we had maybe a more adequate system.
Rational system.
Yeah, something tied to real market values and what's actually happening today. Maybe that takes some of the pressure off of SDCs, because that might be a way to pay for growth. It might not be. SDCs will likely still be a tool, but that's one of the things is cities can't just pay for growth with their general fund and with property taxes.
Our system, unfortunately, requires a lot of squeezing the balloon. You know, you squeeze one thing and it pops out that way. SDCs are definitely someplace that pops out because it doesn't exist under that, but you squeeze it too hard, the balloon breaks. So that's, be careful.
Moving on to a different fee structure it can be spicy, but it's less spicy than I think SDCs, which is municipal service fees. And so what we typically see is, and some cities on the webinar might do this, we see people adding, public safety fees, parks fees, transportation fees to utility bills. And there's a couple of reasons why this actually is popular and doable. Like, it makes it really administratively easy if you're already operating a utility system and billing system to just add a fee there. You have an existing customer base that you can kind of forecast off of your need, things like that, and how much it's gonna go. So this is one of those tools where you're like, I can also capture most of my community through their utility bill. And so I can put a broad-based service fee for something that impacts the whole community, like, public safety and EMS, parks, transportation, and it's relatively stable in that way. The one thing with municipal service fees, this is one of those ways where we're seeing cities have charter amendments introduced to their ballot by the voters based on how much that fee is or how much a city may have worked with their community to get there, and people wanting more control over adding fees like that. I think the other thing with fees is typically we see flat fees, but that's not the only way to charge a service fee. In the toolkit, one of the things I really like is it talks about other examples of cities who don't just charge a flat fee on their municipal service fees. Some people do it by user type, right? So if you're putting something on a water bill for public safety and you have a multifamily development versus a single family home, one has a lot more opportunities to call 911 versus what you would expect. So there's a way to do it there. There are some folks who offer discounts and exemptions to some of their folks who have lower incomes or more restricted incomes that can be helpful. And so it doesn't have to be regressive. There are ways to kind of make policy around that and protect some folks. So we'll probably, in our survey about budget shortfalls, we saw that this was something that people were increasingly looking towards to maybe implementing as well as cutting services.
And I would add, in this category, I think this goes to Jenna's question about, how much do you need to lean on this stakeholder community organizing part of the toolkit when you're looking at some of these things that council can pass, and that's absolutely the case here. I mean, dating myself a little bit, but I remember one city I was covering as a young reporter had a city lighting fee that became very unpopular. Made perfect sense because the cost of maintaining the street lights was very expensive at the time without LEDs, but the sell to the citizens was very poor, right? So people were like, what am I paying? I'm paying for lights. This seems extraordinarily expensive. Whereas you may see more success if you're telling people that you're paying for core services that they really expect you to provide, like public safety or fire.
And once again, as both Jenna and Christian are suggesting, one of the, I won't say charms, but one of the benefits of this is there's such a direct nexus to what you're paying and what you're getting. It's very close to a retail transaction. And there are ways, as Jenna is saying, that it doesn't need to be a flat fee. This is not applicable to cities or most cities, but we have nationally and here a transmission crisis in terms of the transmission of electricity. And It's very, very costly. Most of these, I'm working on this, so I know more than I should. But there haven't been major investments in the electrical transmission system since the 60s and 70s. And different, forms of customers create more costs. And so being able to connect the cost, the passed on cost of infrastructure with how much you're using it, that's something you can do here, and people get that, and they get the sort of the justice of that. And so don't shy away from it. That's something that, and often people who are the highest users of a particular service understand that. And you can have a conversation and a negotiation there. So don't stop, as Jenna's saying, don't stop at the flat fee. Think through all the different ways you can structure these things in a way that gets you the revenue you need and also may win support.
Yeah, and maybe it starts as a flat fee and it transitions over time, If you need it right now and you can't, your voters are somewhat okay with it and, it works out. These are also usually fees that are reviewed annually by the city council. So there could be a new mechanism introduced. It doesn't have to stay the same forever. The next thing we'll talk about is pretty simple. And, these fees are not raising a lot of revenue, but they're an opportunity for you to try to recover some of your administrative costs to them. Sometimes they don't even hit that, but they kind of help a little bit, which is fees for a specific service. And this is things that, usually your voters and community members and just any person who exists on this earth is pretty familiar with fees for a specific service, which is, I have to get a building permit, there's a fee with that, right? Or just any other type of permitting fee, a business license fee for using a room in City Hall to have a wedding or an event or a birthday party. Same with some of the park shelters, things like that. And then public works fees, which usually are when you're connecting into the water system, or it pays for someone to come out and read your water meter. So there's a water meter fee. And some of those are also, to your point, Mark, usage fees. So they could be just straight usage fees on a utility, and as a way to break people out. But we also see usage of services, not necessarily actual infrastructure, in the municipal service fee conversation. So these fees, they're there for a reason. I would use them. I think one thing we're not actually going to dive super into today, but the municipal toolkit does as well, which is a nominal fee that may help you, is any kind of enforcement fees, fines, penalties, things like that. It's usually to discourage people from bad behavior that you don't want. It's not going to pay your bills or solve a revenue shortfall, but are all things that people have, and also makes people pay the fee the first time around if you have a penalty for being late or what have you. Our big thing is sharing kind of that there is a revenue crisis. There are tools that cities have at their disposal, and there's a way to work through them for a revenue strategy while we do bigger things in the revenue reform space. And so there are a couple of things that you as city members can do. Our board president, Mayor Engelke from North Bend, will be kicking off her regional meetings starting next week. She will be going to all 12 regions of the state across the next year to have a conversation about communications and how you are having conversations with your constituents and community members on your provision of service and what cities do. You can increase your outreach to what your city is doing on all of your communications channels, and share back with LOC, particularly me, what you find effective. Is it through surveys? Is it through direct outreach? Is it your faith leaders in your community? That's a big one that I always hear, particularly in small communities. Is it your neighborhood association, what have you, your businesses? And then find those cheerleaders in your community. So your community organizations or the person who always shows up at city council meetings who actually really likes what you're doing, get them to go out and spread the word about all of the awesomeness that the city is doing, and what could be better or enhanced with services, or potential reasons why cities might be hitting a revenue shortfall. It's really great if your community members can learn, understand the property tax system, and share it with their friends. And then we will be producing this a little bit later in the next couple of months, but look out for it. LOC will be producing we already have the questions, but we'll be finding a process to get them out to you all, of putting sample questions to kind of continue to monitoring the communities and voters' outlooks when it comes to property taxes, local revenue sources, and just communication and how they understand the community. So we have sample questions. We'll get those out here soon. Check our weekly bulletin that goes out every week, our website, and we really hope to continue to have you all follow along while we try to roll the rock up the hill that is property tax reform, so people around the state like you can continue to provide critical services. So thank you.